November 11, 1940 began as a gift. Across the upper Midwest, thermometers climbed into the 60s. In Minnesota, the mercury touched 60 degrees. In Michigan, it reached the mid-50s. Along the Mississippi River Valley, men walked outside in shirt sleeves and remarked on the strangeness of it, Armistice Day and warm enough for summer. Duck hunters had been waiting for this. The fall migration was at its peak, and thousands of waterfowl moved south along the great flyways. On the morning of November 11, hunters launched small boats into the backwaters of the Mississippi, the Wisconsin, the St. Croix. They wore light jackets. Some left their heavy coats in the truck. The air was calm, almost humid. The river moved quietly beneath overcast skies. In small towns across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Michigan, children walked to school without hats. Women hung laundry on lines. Farmers worked in fields still soft from autumn rain. In Duluth, shopkeepers propped open their doors. Along Lake Michigan, fishermen prepared their boats for one more run before winter. No one suspected what was forming to the west. By late morning, the sky began to change. The warmth held, but the air felt different, thicker, expectant. A few farmers glanced at the horizon and saw a line of darkness far to the south. Most paid it no attention. Weather moved slowly in those days. Storms announced themselves. This one did not. Shortly after noon, the wind began. It came from the south at first, warm and strong. Then, without warning, it shifted. The temperature fell 5 degrees in minutes. Then 10. Then 20. Hunters on the river felt the change before they could see it. The warm air vanished as though a door had slammed shut. And then the snow came. It did not begin gently. It arrived as a wall, a sudden white curtain that erased the world. Within minutes, visibility dropped to 0. The wind climbed to 50, then 60 miles per hour. The temperature continued to fall. By mid-afternoon, it had dropped more than 30 degrees in less than 2 hours. Men on the water tried to turn their boats toward shore, but the shore had disappeared. The storm that struck on November 11, 1940 was not invisible to science. It had been building for days, but the tools to understand it and the systems to warn the public did not yet exist in any meaningful form. In 1940, the United States Weather Bureau operated with limitations that seem almost incomprehensible today. Weather stations were sparse across the Great Plains. Data traveled by telegraph and telephone, often delayed by hours. Meteorologists had no satellites, no radar, no computer models. They plotted observations by hand on paper maps and made forecasts based on experience and instinct. On November 10, forecasters knew a low-pressure system was moving northeast out of the Rockies. They knew cold air was surging south from Canada, but they did not know how violently these systems would collide. They could not see the structure of the jet stream or the speed of the Arctic front. They had no way to measure the storm's intensity until it was already upon them. The morning forecast for November 11 predicted rain and cooler temperatures. In some regions, it mentioned the possibility of snow, but there was no warning of a blizzard, no alert about life-threatening conditions, no mention of the cold front's speed or the wind that would follow. By the time forecasters understood what was happening, the telegraph lines were already beginning to fail. In Chicago, the Weather Bureau office tried to issue warnings by early afternoon, but communication networks across the region were fragmenting. Phone lines went down in the wind. Radio stations lost power. In many towns, no warning arrived at all. Even if it had, few would have believed it. The day had begun so warm. People trusted what they could feel, and what they felt until the moment the storm hit was a gentle autumn afternoon. The meteorological reality was this: an intense low-pressure system had moved east across the Dakotas, while a powerful Arctic high-pressure system plunged south from Canada. The two collided over the upper Midwest. The result was a pressure gradient so steep that winds exploded across the region. Behind the front, Temperatures fell at a rate rarely seen in recorded history. No forecast system in 1940 could have predicted the precise timing, but better coordination, faster communication, and an understanding of the danger might have saved lives. Instead, tens of thousands of people, on boats, in fields, on rural roads, were caught completely unaware. Reuben Paulson was a duck hunter from Waterville, Minnesota. On the morning of November 11, he and a friend drove to the Mississippi River backwaters near Lake Pepin. The weather was warm. They wore light jackets and rubber boots. They carried decoys and shotguns and a thermos of coffee. They launched their boat shortly after 10 in the morning. The water was calm. Ducks moved overhead in long formations. By noon, they had shot a few mallards and were working their way through a narrow channel bordered by marsh grass and willow. Paulson later recalled that the wind changed suddenly. It came from the northwest and hit them like a fist. Within minutes, the temperature dropped. The warm air vanished. The sky darkened and snow began to fall, not in flakes but in sheets. They tried to turn the boat back toward the landing, but the wind pushed them sideways. The snow was so thick they could not see the shoreline. They could barely see each other. Paulson held the tiller and steered by instinct, trying to follow the narrow channels they had traveled that morning. The cold was immediate and brutal. Water from the river spray froze on their jackets. Their gloves stiffened. The boat rocked violently in the wind and snow piled on the floorboards. Paulson's hands began to lose feeling. His friend crouched low in the bow, trying to shield himself from the wind. They ran the boat aground on what they thought was the shore. It was a small island covered in brush. They pulled the boat partway onto the mud and huddled against it, trying to block the wind. The snow continued. The temperature fell below 20 degrees, then 15. Their clothes were soaked and freezing stiff. Visibility remained near zero. Paulson knew they could not stay on the island, but he also knew they could not navigate the river. The channels were narrow and winding. One wrong turn would put them in open water where the wind could capsize them. They waited, hoping the storm would ease. It did not. By late afternoon, Paulson decided they had to try. They pushed the boat back into the water and started the motor. He steered blindly, following what he thought was the channel. Several times the boat scraped bottom. Once, it lodged against a sandbar and they had to rock it free. The wind screamed. The snow never stopped. They reached the landing after dark, more than 6 hours after the storm began. Paulson's hands were frost-damaged. His friend could barely walk. They had traveled less than 3 miles. Reuben Paulson survived. Many others on the river that day did not. By mid-afternoon on November 11, the storm had overwhelmed the region. Along the Mississippi River, hundreds of duck hunters were stranded. Some made it to shore and took shelter in abandoned cabins or beneath overturned boats. Others remained on the water, unable to find land in the whiteout. Rescue boats launched from towns along the river but were driven back by the wind and ice. Visibility was measured in feet. In Minnesota, the highway department dispatched snowplows, but the roads disappeared beneath drifts almost as quickly as they could be cleared. Winds gusted to 70 miles per hour. Snow fell at rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour. Temperatures dropped into the single digits. Cars stalled and were buried. Drivers abandoned vehicles and tried to walk to farmhouses. Some made it. Others collapsed in fields and ditches. Telegraph lines snapped under the weight of ice and wind. Telephone poles splintered. By evening, entire counties were cut off from communication. In rural areas, families had no idea the storm was a regional disaster. They only knew they could not see beyond their windows. Power lines failed across Wisconsin and Michigan. Towns went dark. Schools that had dismissed children early now had no way to reach parents. Some children made it home. Others were caught on rural roads. A school bus in Minnesota became stuck in a drift. The driver and children huddled inside for hours until rescuers on foot reached them after midnight. On Lake Michigan, fishing boats radioed distress calls before their radios died. The Coast Guard launched rescue missions but were forced back by ice building on the decks of their vessels. 2 freighters ran aground. Crew members clung to frozen rigging through the night. In cities, the infrastructure held longer. Chicago, Milwaukee, and Duluth maintained some services, but even there transportation collapsed. Streetcars stopped. Buses stalled. Passengers walked home through blinding snow and wind that tore at their clothes. The storm's speed was its greatest weapon. Temperature drops of 50 degrees in 12 hours. Winds that rose from calm to gale force in minutes. Snow that fell so fast and hard that plows could not keep pace. By nightfall, the upper Midwest was paralyzed. Rescue efforts continued in darkness, but many areas remained unreachable. The wind did not stop. The snow did not stop. The cold deepened. And across the region, people waited for morning. November 12 arrived in silence. The wind had finally stopped. The snow had ended. The sky cleared to a brittle, pale blue. Across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Michigan, the landscape was unrecognizable. Snowdrifts stood 15 feet high in places. Roads had vanished. Entire towns were buried to the rooftops. Cars sat frozen in place, half-covered, their occupants sometimes still inside. Telephone poles lay snapped across fields. Power lines hung in frozen loops. On the Mississippi River, rescue crews returned at first light. They found boats locked in ice. They found decoys frozen to the water. They found hunters who had made it to shore but had not survived the night. Some were found sitting upright, leaning against trees, their clothing frozen solid. In Minnesota alone, more than 20 duck hunters died. Across the region, the death toll climbed steadily as searchers reached isolated farms and stranded vehicles. 49 people in Minnesota, 21 in Wisconsin, 18 in Michigan, dozens more in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. The final count exceeded 150. Many victims were found within sight of shelter. The storm's speed and intensity had been so complete that even short distances became fatal. Farmers died between their barns and houses. Drivers froze in cars just yards from farmhouses they could not see. In the days that followed, newspapers across the country carried the story, but the scale of the disaster was difficult to communicate. There were no photographs of the storm itself, only the aftermath: drifts, wreckage, silent, frozen fields. The Armistice Day Blizzard changed the way weather was forecast in America. In the months and years after November 1940, the Weather Bureau expanded its observation network, improved communication systems, and developed better methods for tracking fast-moving storms. The disaster demonstrated the deadly cost of poor warnings and delayed information. But for the families who lost fathers, brothers, and sons that day, no improvement could undo the loss. The storm had come without warning, and it had killed without mercy. Today, the Armistice Day Blizzard remains one of the most lethal weather events in American history. It is studied by meteorologists as a case of rapid cyclogenesis, a storm that intensified with extraordinary speed. It is remembered by historians as a turning point in public safety and weather forecasting. And it is remembered still in the small towns along the Mississippi River, where every November people pause to honor those who went out on a warm morning and never came home. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.